right, everybody, welcome back once again to the Pat Flynn Show here live with Dr. Gavin Kerr. And we're going to do some Q&A. So we welcome any questions you have. And we don't really have much of an agenda for this show. I think we were going to just kind of talk about some of our current projects and stuff we're thinking about and researching on, and then jam on any questions from the audience. But Gavin, you had something you wanted to reveal at the beginning of this episode. Are we ready? Are we ready to do that?
Are we ready for the reveal, the revelation?
Yeah, yeah, I think we are. Short story: Gavin's got a new tattoo, and this is you haven't even shared it. You haven't even shared it to Facebook yet. Someone's going to get.
I haven't even shared it to Facebook. Yeah, so I got a new tattoo yesterday. Well, the start of the start of a new tattoo. So I have to go back for another session to get it finished off. So it's on my right arm here.
Let's take a peek.
I'm not just out of the gym. That's not why I'm in a vest, because it's healing. So let's see. If you can see that, it's a Chinese Asian dragon.
Yeah, it looks sharp.
So there it is there.
So what's the story behind this one?
I kind of wanted an Asian dragon, sort of, kung fu sort of animal, and dragons in sort of Western culture are always very satanic, very evil sort of creatures. But the dragon in the Eastern sort of Asian Chinese mythology, they're not these evil sort of satanic creatures. They're more like guardians, and they signify kind of virtues. And so I thought it'd be cool to get that. So my left arm is a lot of religious tattoos. I've got the Holy Spirit and everything on it, and the cross and all on it. So I thought my right arm would be sort of nice to get my martial arts in there as well. So we got the dragon's head yesterday. And then the dragon's claw holding an orb is just going to go below my thorns and barbed wire. And it's going to get colored in. There's going to be flames and stuff. And its hair and all. It's going to be kind of, all yellows and reds and everything going in. So I'm booked in. So I have to give a shout out. Have to get a shout out to my artist, Sarah, from Sazzle Shark Tattoos. All right. So awesome day. 7 hours in the chair with Sarah yesterday at Sazzle Shark Tattoos. It's based in Belfast City Skinworks. So anybody in and around Belfast, and you're into tattoos, check them out. But big shout out to Sarah. She talked me through it. 7 hours. It's been the most painful tattoo I've had to date. The most painful tattoo to date.
Yeah. I don't have any tattoos. So I have no frame of reference on any of this.
Yeah, especially in there. Just try pinching yourself in there, see what it feels like.
Yeah, well, my kids do that enough for me, so I know how that feels. Our youngest is quite the pincher right now, so it looks great, man. That looks super sharp. So I'm excited to see the finished product. Thanks for that's very cool. I already see lots of questions coming in here, guys. So yeah, please send them in. We are going to do Q&A, and we'll get to it sooner rather than later, and we'll get through as much as we can. But aside from the tattoo, Gavin, what else is new? Catch us up on kind of your what are you writing about? What are you researching? What are you even just thinking about? Like, kind of like I guess because there's always like different things, right? Like I don't know about you, but there's always like the thing I'm writing, a whole bunch of other things that I'm kind of researching, and then always ancillary topics that I've always got questions in the back of my mind and stuff I'm just kind of thinking about that maybe I'd like to get onto eventually doing a deeper dive in, but just haven't,
Yeah. So I guess in the last week, what I've been thinking a lot about has been modality and the metaphysics of modality. And this is because, you've heard me criticize the idea, of God's necessity being, thought out in terms of existing in all possible worlds and contingency, existing only in some worlds. Because that seems to deploy a synchronic view of modality, whereby possibilities are synchronic with actuality. And I think Aquinas has more of a diachronic view of modality, that possibilities are rooted in the actualities of things. And, if a possibility, becomes an actuality, it will come about kind of for a temporal creature. It'll come about over a period of time, but it's not a synchronic possibility. That seems to be something that Scotus seemed to believe in, but Aquinas wasn't really a big fan.
So you would, that sounds to me like the first chapter of Real Essentialism from Oderberg, right? You would be pretty much in line with that then.
Yeah. So I've been thinking about that, and then it was just I was returning to some of Eleanor Stump's work on simplicity, And I was reading her treatment of how God can remain simple, yet there's still the possibility that he could have willed a different creation or could have willed not to create. In other words, he could have been free to create. And Stump deals with this in her chapter on simplicity in terms of whether or not such would constitute an accident in God. Would God have some sort of accident, and thus, would that be inconsistent with his simplicity? And she takes a really interesting approach to it, because she argues that for Aquinas, an accident isn't something that an entity possesses just in some possible worlds, but not in all possible worlds. So typically, contemporary views, we distinguish between essential and accidental properties. And essential properties are properties that a thing has in every world in which it exists, and accidental properties are properties that it doesn't have in every world in which it exists. But Stump pointed out that already, Peter of Spain, who wrote a medieval manual of logic, he was, passing down a position on accidents that there are some accidents which things have, and they will always have these accidents. And so that would seem to suggest that in every possible world in which this thing, exists, it has this accident. For example, crows being black. And this is how the medievals, sort of thought about accidents. They didn't think about accidents in terms of, these synchronic possibilities, where a thing could sort of lack something in one world but not lack it in the other world. They rather thought about accidents in terms of impoverished or incomplete state of being. So, so the being of an accident is dependent on the being of the substance. And that then indicates that just because something is different, say in different possible worlds, doesn't mean that those differences signify accidents that the thing possesses. So that means then a thing can have differences in different possible worlds, but those differences aren't accidents. And so with that, she holds that the different choices that God could have made don't signify accidents, because they don't signify impoverished or incomplete being the way accidents do.
Right.
So I was reading about that, and I was turning that because I'm kind of writing.
Is this in her section on knowledge or will? You're talking about her book Aquinas, right?
Yeah, her big book Aquinas. Yeah.
So
it's in the section on simplicity. On
simplicity. Right, and she has a section on will in relation to simplicity there, which I thought was quite good, right? Because she does draw some of the distinctions you find among contemporary philosophers of Cambridge properties and stuff like that too. But I find that her treatment is much more in depth and true, I think, to the scholastic system as a whole.
Yeah. So, well, I mean, I was reading that today, and I was just mulling it over because I'm writing a paper on this, and I was thinking about it, and I was thinking, well, yes, that's interesting, and I think she is right that a difference across possible worlds doesn't signify sort of that a thing has accidents, but I think the whole thrust of this debate about God's freedom in creating is not so much to do with his simplicity. I don't think that's sort of where the issue lies. I think it's more to do with his immutability. And now his immutability is tied up with his simplicity, right. But I think it's more to do with God's being able to change. Okay, that he could have willed one thing rather than the other. And it seems to me that, the crux of this issue lies in God's agency. Can God be an agent and, will, multiple different things without him changing in accord with the different things that he wills? Right. So if he were to will a different creation, would that constitute a difference in his will? Yeah. So I'm sort of steering that issue in this article I'm writing away from the issue of simplicity and whether or not God has any accidents, and focusing more on God's agency. And I think if we can resolve it in terms of God's agency, then that'll have a knock-on effect for God's simplicity. And
right. I agree. It seems to be that it's immutability. And like you said, these things all sort of come in a package, right? Are you in this article you're writing, developing the same type of response? Because for those people who are interested in these technical debates around divine simplicity, we did a whole episode on reason and theology. What was that, like 2 months ago or something?
Yeah.
Where we went through different theories of intentional action and stuff like
Yeah.
that, right? And a lot of these issues, I think, can be resolved when we understand that God's action is basic and immediate, that the action of course of the agent is in the patient, right? Which is kind of basic Aristotelianism in a lot of ways. So that way you can have this sort of contingent latitude of different worlds extrinsic to God. Possible worlds, if you want to call them that, well, God remains annotatively essentially the same. I know some, so I'm okay with using possible world semantics, I guess, somewhat, as long as we clarify the metaphysical commitments up front, right?
So I need to do more reading on that. So thus far, I'm skeptical of possible worlds and possible world semantics, and thus far I haven't been convinced. I just had Simo Nutila's book. I hope I pronounced that right. Simo Nutila's book, Modalities in Medieval Philosophy, that just arrived a few days ago. Cool. I'm going off for a week on Sunday, and I hope to get a bit of peace, and I'll read through it then. Hopefully come back with some fresh insights. But at the minute, I am skeptical of possible world semantics for giving an account of modality. I think that emerges as a response to a philosophical problematic in the 20th century that wasn't really a problematic for Aquinas. And so his metaphysics of modality can be worked out, I think, independently of that, and it need not get caught up in all the sorts of issues that possible worlds semantics get caught up in.
Excellent. Yeah, cool. Now you have another. So you've been thinking about lots of stuff. That's the short. Short, right? As usual. You've got an article on the Fourth Way coming out pretty soon, right?
I do. Yeah. I got the galley proofs from the American Catholic Phil Quarterly, and it's on the Fourth Way, and it's going to be given an the typical metaphysical interpretation of the Fourth Way, to the effect that Aquinas' reasoning from what's per aliud, or what's through participation, to what is per se, and that's reasoning that he's giving in the Fourth Way. That's what the approximating relation is in the first part of the Fourth Way that I argue, and to my mind that establishes the Fourth Way as a heavyweight metaphysical argument for God's existence. So that's coming out in the American Catholic Phil Quarterly. Should be out in the autumn. I just I had a read through of the galley proofs. They're all fine, and so I just have to sign the publication agreement, send that off, and we're good to go. So that should be appearing. Yeah, awesome.
Congrats. So we've got a lot of questions. I feel like maybe we should start getting to some of these if we want to.
Right. Okay. Cool.
Is that good with you?
That's good with me. But what have you been thinking about?
Oh my gosh. Yeah, lots of stuff. So I've been thinking about this. Yeah, real quick. We won't bore people too much with this. So keep sending your questions in, guys. We'll get to them in a minute. I've been thinking a lot about mind and world, as we know from the conversations that we have. And this sort of started because I was very intrigued by this suggestive argument that Haldane gives for the prime thinker, which we've talked about. It's a very interesting argument. But he only kind of makes it suggestive in his work, and he kind of like teases it, and he's like, yes, if somebody wants to take this further, they can take it further if they want, right? So I've been trying to take it further, but then it's opened up a whole bunch of issues, as these things typically do when you try to build this stuff out. I mean, that's kind of like the cool thing when you try and build out an argument is all the different areas of research and inquiry that this takes you on. Because for me, in the sense of building out an argument, it's not. At least for this one, I'm really not trying to prove the conclusion that God exists. One, I'm already convinced of it. Like, if the argument doesn't work, it doesn't work. For me, it's a way to learn more about certain facts of the world, right? And so I've just been thinking heavily about exactly what do I think of mind and world and its relation. So I'm working through Mind and World by McDowell, which you've recommended. Awesome. Yeah. Which is good. I know we've been chatting about that a little bit, and so far I like it. You're right. He's kind of, when you read different philosophers like that, it's often kind of like learning a new language. You know what I mean? It's not always immediately accessible. Lonergan was like that. So I know I have to be a little bit patient with him because I'm just not used to his style. And I've been engaging, as we were chatting with earlier, of Haldane's critiques of McDowell. It's just kind of like reading the surrounding opinions of McDowell and stuff like that, just to help with the general context. And then I've got Taylor and Dreyfus's book, Regaining Realism, on the docket as well. So I don't have any real settled positions on any of this yet. It's all kind of a lot of question marks for me right now.
Okay, I'm glad you're reading Mind and World. So John Haldane was my PhD examiner, and so he examined me on the Feast of Thomas Aquinas for my PhD. And so, as we were talking about last week, this is what I wrote my doctorate on, this sort of Mind and World stuff. And after the examination, don't think I'm breaking confidence by saying this, Haldane says, Gavin, you know, McDowell, Sellers, these are people that would be great, sort of, guys to read and work into your work. So I mean, you should maybe give them a go. So in your sort of post, PhD life, maybe have a look at writing some articles, McDowell, Aquinas, and Sellers and stuff. Right. And Haldane was saying to me that he had suggested to McDowell that McDowell engaged with Thomas, and McDowell wrote that paper on Sellers' Thomism, where he criticizes Sellers for not being Thomistic enough. And so I wrote that article that we talked about that Jim mentioned last week on McDowell and Aquinas. I think that with the Mind and World, you're right, it is very difficult prose, very, very difficult to read, very difficult to follow. It's like a mixture of Hegel, Anscombe, and Wittgenstein all in one. It really is. And that's his most accessible work, his...
Because it's mostly from lectures, right?
Yeah, it was the lectures he gave. I think was it the John Locke lectures at Oxford?
I think so.
But the thing that really struck me about McDowell, and it's always stayed with me, is that he's making the case that the very idea of a thought doesn't implicitly contain within itself a gap between mind and world, or an epistemic distance. We're used to thinking of a thought as being a thought of something, and automatically we envisage that of which it is a thought is at some sort of distance from the thought itself.
Right. This would be a general mediational theory of mind, right? And I'm convinced that that's wrong, right? I don't have a settled position on what form of contact realism or direct realism I think is the best yet. So my question marks are all on kind of one side, if you will, right? But sorry, continue.
I think that in Mind and World, the sort of case he makes against the myth of the given, a preconceptual given in experience, which then is worked upon and brought up to conceptualization. I think that critique I think that's solid. That the given can't play any sort of role in our epistemology, because if our judgments about the empirical world are to be grounded by the world about which they are judgments, it can't be that empirical world doesn't give any sort of notional content to those judgments. In other words, the content of experience has to be the content of understanding, if our understanding is to be about a world disclosed to us in experience, in which case what is disclosed to us in experience is conceptual, just as our understanding of it is conceptual. Now, as Haldane pointed out in some of the pieces you were sharing with me, that brings with it the charge of idealism. And McDowell kind of addresses that. He says, there seems to be this sort of position that, unless you have a conceptualist given, everything is conceptual, and so you're led into idealism. But McDowell, holds that, that charge of idealism presupposes the myth of the given in the first place. If we reject the myth of the given and hold that reality itself is conceptually loaded, i.e. it's such that it's able to bring into operation conceptual capacities, then we don't need to swing between idealism or a conceptualist given. Right. And what I think he's getting at there is what us Aristotelians call forms.
Of course.
Reality is formed, and so the intelligible species of our thought conforms to the form of the thing in reality.
Right. And Haldane's one of his criticisms seems to be that this should lead you towards theism. That's one of his criticisms of McDowell. Right. So his kind of, I guess, criticism of McDowell is he's still too much of a naturalist given his commitments.
I'm not. McDowell doesn't seem to go in for metaphysics all that much. So I just don't think he would be led down the path of entertaining those sorts of discussions about theism. And I think this is because, from what I've read from him, his sort of work originated in semantics, epistemology, philosophy of language, and that's what all his work has been engaged in. And then he branches out into ethics from that. But the metaphysics doesn't seem to be all that prominent. And I think you have to have, a kind of a real leaning towards metaphysics to start to evaluate whether or not your positions would not lead to theism. And I just don't think that's on McDowell's radar. I don't know what I would say about whether or not McDowell would be disposed towards theism. I just don't know. Certainly, his entire philosophical outlook is not one which is ill-disposed towards theism. But I wouldn't know what to say as to whether or not he would be disposed towards theism.
Right. Yeah. It fascinates me. Well, I'll hold off on making any more comments on McDowell because I just have not read enough of him yet, or to. I don't want to speak. I don't want to rush into myself, making myself look foolish. Right? I think it's always a good policy if you can help it right on certain subjects, so you just don't have that much experience. But it's been fruitful so far, and it's good because reading your paper before was helpful too, because you have this paper, so that kind of helped situate me and of what to expect and stuff like that, and it helped with just learning some of the language before diving in with is it McDowell or McDowell? Or is that just
I know he used to come to Ireland quite a bit, and I know somebody that did a doctorate on McDowell Anscombe, and he spoke to McDowell. So this is a fellow student of mine from Northern Ireland, and in the north we would say McDowell, and McDowell does his family are from Ireland. There's some point, grandparents from Ireland. A lot of Americans' families are from Ireland, especially with Mick as a surname. But he asked McDowell, what is it? Is it McDowell or McDowell? And he says it's pronounced McDowell. So that's
it's McDowell. Okay, cool. All right.
But over here. Yeah.
I mean, the other thing I've been thinking about. So I've been thinking about a lot about knowledge, right? Because when I for Aquinas, when we kind of know something, like that's something like literally thingifies our intellect, right? Which is when we come to know a horse, the horse literally horsifies our intellect, which is kind of like shares in the same rhythm of, you will, the sharing in the form. Yeah. So to me, the interesting question then of like is really coming up with a theory of how we go wrong on this epistemology, right? Yeah. Now Aquinas has things to say about that in relation to the fall and stuff like that. Yeah. So I've been thinking about that a fair amount, and especially differences, because clearly to know something doesn't mean that we define something, and when we share in the form of something too, and I think this is where Haldane is useful, right? Clearly, and we talked about this with Jim. We'll get to questions here in a minute. I'll just say a few more things, right? We're not like popping the full and complete essence out of something right into our heads with all of its complete definitional content, right? Obviously not. Right. Because I think I know, dogs, right, pretty well. But I don't think I could define what a dog is, at least not in relation to if I were to go through, certain textbooks and stuff like that. So been thinking about how all that plays out in intimistic epistemology. Has been interesting. I don't know if you have any thoughts on any of that. And just one more thing, and the other thing too is normativity in relation to epistemology and theism in general, right? Because I think this is important, especially with the intellect, right? It is a presumption of all of us, right, that the intellect's proper object is intelligible being and truth. But that, like we want to say more than that, right? Because what if it's not, right? What if it's just what if intellect or reason or mind isn't naturally ordered towards these things, but it's ordered through things like survival or this or that. So one is first showing that things do have a proper object, faculties have a proper object. And then the epistemological question of discerning what that proper object is has been a project that I've been working on. So I'll punt it all over to you for any of your thoughts on any and all of that, and then we'll get to some questions here.
So one thing that strikes me in what you say is this idea that, when we think about a horse, the horse sort of thingifies our intellect. Our intellect becomes horse-like because it has the intelligible species of the horse. That really is sort of in distinction to the view that mental content just enters into an empty mind like furniture into the house, because when the furniture enters into the house doesn't take on the form of the furniture. It doesn't correspond, or it doesn't conform to the furniture. It literally just houses the furniture. So thinking of, the mind as some sort of, dwelling place for mental content is really just the opposite direction of travel for the Thomist, given that for the Thomist, acts of thinking are systematically, sort of divergent qua acts themselves, not qua the contents of those acts. So an act of thought about a horse is kind of, a horsey sort of act, whereas an act of thought about a tree is a tree kind of act.
Right. And
I think what that indicates is something that we talked about last week, is that there can't be an empty thought. On Aquinas' view, there can't be just this empty thought into which content enters. Any act of thinking is always an act of thinking which is intentional. Okay, so it's directed towards something that's formed after something. And insofar as the intellect in itself stands in potency, what actualizes the intellect can't be itself, but must be something other than itself in order to bring about these intellectual acts, or what McDowell calls conceptual operations. I think with that in place, then we've pretty much secured realism, and I would call it a critical realism, because it answers to Kant's critical problem that of the relationship between mind and world. And then I think once you get that in place, you can start to ask these questions, about normativity and about error theory and where we go wrong. So on this account, we go wrong not because, let's say in a veridical and non-veridical experience, we don't go wrong because there's some common content between the two and we just can't tell the difference. We go wrong but because one act of thinking in the veridical experience is being brought about by the intellect's proper object, and in the other case, the non-veridical experience, it's not the proper object which brings it about. It's some, let's say you've got a head full of acid, or you're drunk or something like that, and you're seeing things. And in this position is known as disjunctivism.
Right.
And I think that's a position that the Thomist should endorse. And I think, actually, as memory serves me, I wrote an article on Leon Noel, who was an epistemologist, so very big in the Thomistic critical realism school. He was the opponent of Gilson, Gilson was his opponent. And Leon Noel argued for a form of immediate realism, and I wrote an article on him in the International Phil Quarterly. And as memory serves me, I think I argued that Noel's immediate realism would endorse some form of disjunctivism. It was a few years ago since I wrote the article, but as memory serves me, I'm pretty sure I did. I remember researching disjunctivism for that article. So I think disjunctivism is a position which is amenable to Thomists. When we get to normativity then, and some of the issues that you brought up, so the normativity of essence, so whether or not we can know normatively what the essence of a dog is, or a cow, or something like that. Maybe four-legged dogs is the aberration, and the real essence of a dog is three-legged dog. I think, epistemologically speaking, a Thomistic epistemologist will just say, well, look, that's an empirical question. We know that there is that a thing has an essence, and if it's a material thing, well, Thomas and the division of the sciences, things whose being is such that they depend on matter and motion for their existence and for their being understood. Well, they're investigated in natural sciences. So the natural sciences can tell us what the essence of those things is, and why most dogs have 4 legs, but some dogs have 3 legs. And in those cases, a scientist can point out, well, this dog has 3 legs because there was this sort of chromosomal problem, there was this genetic defect which occurred, as opposed to all these other dogs. And so I mean that's something that I think as epistemologists we just leave to the natural scientists.
Yeah, I mean the one of the difficulties there though is you could just be pushing it back, right? Well, why assume this chromosomal configuration is the norm, right? Mm-hmm. Versus you say like maybe the defect is the norm. And so the point is that I brought this up with Brian yesterday too, mm-hmm. is that without going to say a reformed epistemology or just mm-hmm. Defensive intuitionism, right? Mm-hmm. Which I don't think those are illegitimate. I think those are potential solutions here. Because obviously, we don't want to say the norm is just the norm statistically in terms of mm-hmm. statistical commonality, right? Because clearly there's going to be a counterexample set, and it's quite easy mm-hmm. to imagine a situation mm-hmm. where, I don't know, for whatever weird event, some power mm-hmm. plant goes off. It just becomes statistically more common for dogs to have only 3 mm-hmm. legs, right? Mm-hmm. Instead of 4, right? So you see the kind of the general thing that I've been thinking about with this, right? Yeah.
Mm-hmm. So I think what I would say to that is, biologists, and given an account of speciation, they use a lot of different sort of criteria for speciation. One of them is reproducibility, parental descent, that sort of thing. And for a while, it was thought that that was the only sort of account of speciation that we could have. That's that's the Darwinian picture. Mm-hmm. But there's other, sort of criteria for speciation, which come into that, including, genetic sequence, genome, that sort of stuff. And if we can bring all those together, then we can say the members of this species, let's say dog, for instance, have all of these features, and all of these features combined bring it about that dogs have this particular morphology, let's say 4-leggedness, thereby indicating that dogs which don't have that are defective in some sort, are defective as the members of the species. Right. So, I mean, I think you can get normativity there. But I would point out when it comes to normativity with things conditioned by matter and motion, it's not the same kind of normativity that you're going to get in things not conditioned by matter and motion, such as in mathematics or metaphysics. So I think there will be gray areas, speciation. So there will be a fact of the matter, as to which species is which. But on the epistemological question, how do we know what that is? That's going to require an awful lot of detective work, and there will be blurring around the edges, right, especially given evolutionary descent.
Right. Yeah. That's essentially where I'm at with that right now. Mm-hmm. Is that some things aren't even intelligible, like intellect. Once we understand what we mean by intellect, it isn't even intelligible to call something intellect unless intelligible being is its proper object, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
So some things, like I think, we can really know what its proper object is. It's teleology. My mm-hmm. question is just like, how much investigative work on kind of the empirically are needed mm-hmm. for discovering normativity without, again, appealing to things like reformed epistemology or defending intuitionism. Which again, I'm not against that. I'm just trying to see if there's other avenues. You know what I mean, right? Mm-hmm.
I mean, I think in principle, Aquinas's epistemology would, kind of really move away from reformed epistemology or intuitionism, because Aquinas is going to want to say, given his metaphysical view, the things are constituted by, the material things, through matter and form, and so they have an essence. Now, that essence may not always be discoverable. It may be elusive, but it's a fact of the matter that things do have essences, and so our natural scientists just have to put in the legwork of, finding out what the essence is. Also to point out that for Thomas, knowledge is defeasible, and revisable. It's not always the case of the true or the false. It's more the case of the more or the less true. Mm-hmm. We always get to some kind of truth, when we know a thing, but then we can add to it. We can modify it. We can expand upon it. We can revisit overlooked insights. Right. And that's how our different domains of knowledge progress. So that this idea that to be certain, knowledge has to be absolutely true or absolutely false isn't something that you find in Aquinas' thinking.
Right, because knowledge it's an analogical term for Thomas, just like being. Just as being comes in many ways, so does knowledge. I think that's absolutely right. I think that's something that epistemologists would do well to continue to explore. Right.
Yeah.
There's lots of questions, Gavin. Should we turn to some of these now?
Yeah. Let's do it. Let's have a look.
See it. All right, guys, we're coming for you now. Harry Stark says, "Hello, everyone. Hello to you, Harry. Good to have you here." He says,
"Hey, Harry."
He says, "These are my questions when it's time." Well, it is time right now. Question 1 from Harry says, "If someone presupposes that God does not exist, do you think that the philosophical arguments are strong at this point, or strong enough, I guess, to make someone change their world view?" Well, I'll say they sort of made me change mine. So we got one example. Of course, it wasn't just. I don't want to make it seem like it was just like, oh, I was an atheist, and then I read Gavin's book, and then suddenly, pop, I'm a theist. It's always more complicated than that, right? But they played a role, right? They definitely played a role. So, Gavin, let's get your thoughts on this first. I'll keep the question up for now.
Yeah. So, well, thanks for sharing that, Pat. Anyway, that you were sort of brought along by the arguments. It's been a real humbling experience for me. I mean, in the past, few months, a few people have reached out to me and said, kind of just listening to some of your podcasts and reading your work has really kind of, helped me distort a few things out with, what I believe about this. And, that's just a really humbling experience, to hear that kind of speaks more sociologically to Harry's question there. But on the philosophical point, if someone presupposes that God does not exist, do you think that the arguments are strong at this point in time to make someone change their worldview? Well, I certainly think that the arguments are strong enough to show that atheism is false. I certainly do think that. But that's a different issue with, being strong enough to change somebody's worldview, because it's not often the case that somebody will change their worldview on the basis of a strong argument. Because to change somebody's worldview, an argument doesn't just have to be strong, it has to be persuasive as well, because changes of worldview, they're not mathematical. We're not, as we've been discussing with Mind and World, and last week when we were discussing with Jim, just the fact that mindedness isn't something locked up in a head, but is a feature of our being in the world. Shows the impossibility of artificial intelligence, which could have the kind of rationality that we have. My point here is that changing our worldview is not like changing a computer program. You don't just put in, the proper programming, say, strong argument, and all of a sudden it changes. It's an existential choice to change a worldview. And whilst one would hope that existential choices are well informed by intellectual ideals, existential choices are also predominantly, in fact, informed by ethical ideals. There's another book by Charles Taylor, Pat, Authenticity as an ethical ideal, or the ethics of authenticity, where he defends authenticity as an ethical ideal. That authenticity isn't, being really enlightened or really smart the way, modern philosophy took it to be, but it's more an ethical ideal where we're measured by a framework of which we are not the authors, and we can know that we're not the authors of our ethical framework because we can feel to, act in accord with that framework. And because, our existential decisions tend to be informed by ethical ideals as well, sometimes changing that worldview can conflict with those ethical ideals, and that makes it difficult to make that existential choice. So yes, I do think the philosophical arguments are strong enough, but I think making that existential choice requires more than philosophical arguments. The philosophical arguments are strong enough to show that atheism is false. That's only part of the way. If somebody wants to change their worldview, there's lots of different things have to go into the mix as well.
Yes, I agree. So it's such a personal, psychological thing as well. And, I don't know if it's worth spending a whole lot of time on it, but, sometimes people will make the charge that you do it for emotional reasons. You just can't just can't deal with the world being nihilistic or you going poof at death. You know, I think I can honestly say that for me, it's kind of neutral of like, you know, like it's not like Christianity is the softest or Catholicism like most comforting worldview. You know what I mean? It's just, it's hard. It's hard in a lot of ways. It's hard. If you take it seriously, it's very hard. The problem of suffering, the problem of evil, the you know, final things, final judgment. I think if I was looking for like the most emotionally comforting thing, I'd probably just like go be like a universalist or something, right?
Yeah.
But I don't think that's true, right? So the kind of, you know, so I've gone to something that I think is probably less comforting overall in terms of what I think would give me the, I don't know, greatest psychological ease or something like that, right? So I just wanted to put that in there because these things are, yes, there's ethical considerations, but there's great psychological, emotional considerations too. And I guess the best thing you can try and do is just flag those considerations for yourself and just try and use the light of reason as best as you possibly can, right?
Yeah, I think that's right. And I mean, just to take up your point that, you know, Christianity is not the easiest religion to follow, and it's not just because there's a very demanding moral code, and it's not just that, you know, there are an awful lot of, you know, very strong theological commitments, you know, the various ecumenical councils. It's because, you know, when it comes down to it, what is God asking of you in Christianity? He's asking you for everything, literally everything. There's nothing that you can keep from God. He wants everything from you. It's that complete and utter commitment. That's what God is asking from you. So if, you know, you're going to give yourself to God, you're giving literally everything to God. There's no holding back. It's like a marriage. And that is a, you know, significant existential choice. Now, the great thing about Christianity is the promise, you know, made by Christ, you know, of the Holy Spirit, you know, which grants, you know, the sanctifying grace by which, when we give everything of ourselves to God, we know that we will have God's assistance in doing that. It's not it's not of ourselves pulling ourselves up by our bootstraps that we can live up to, you know, the grace, you know, of our baptism. It's God, you know, granting us the grace so as to be able to do that, you know, that trying to do it ourselves, well, that's Pelagianism, you know, that we can, you know, save ourselves, you know, without God's help. But yeah, I think that just is an important point that you raised, that God asks everything of us. And that's that.
When you recognize what that means, as I think I did at one point, it's terrifying. If you're being honest with yourself, that's a terrifying thing.
So, I mean, all of that then is involved in, you know, changing one's worldview. So, the philosophical arguments, I mean, basic point is I think they're strong enough to show that atheism is false, and that gets you a good step along the way, really, if you're thinking about changing your worldview to theism. But there's lots of other steps to take as well.
Right, cool. All right, let's keep moving along because we got lots here. Harry's second question is, academically, do you think theism will be as dominant as atheistic logical positivism was during the middle of the 20th century in 50 to 70 years?
That's interesting. I'd hate to make a prediction, but this is kind of how I feel about things. I'm going to say no. I don't think it will be as dominant as atheistic logical positivism was during the middle of the 20th century. But let me qualify that. The reason why I say no is because I don't think, academically speaking, that any particular school of or philosophical position is going to predominate in 50 to 70 years. Because I think that the conditions for a school to predominate in the academy the way logical positivism did are not in the academy at the minute. What I mean by that, for logical positivism to predominate, you had various institutions where people who kind of were engaged in the same sort of research and the same kind of work were able to come together and, you know, really make a big deal of this philosophical school. So, you know, say for instance, you know, they came from England, they came from the States, you know, from all over Europe, and they gathered in Vienna under the auspices of Morris Schlick. I don't think those conditions are in place in in the academic world today, because what we see in the academic world today are a lot of philosophy departments in various institutions with, a lot of diverse and multifaceted specialities of, academics doing this thing or that thing or the other thing. So I'm at an institution. I'm a Thomist, a scholastic. I engage with analytic philosophy. One of my colleagues, he engages with continental philosophy, ancient philosophy, postmodern philosophy, specializes in the thought of Eric Chavara. I've got another colleague who specializes in Kierkegaard. I've got another colleague, who specializes in the thought of Jean de La Rochelle. And there's so many different, plurivosities in the contemporary academy that I don't think any one position or school of thought is really going to take root. And I think for theism to take root, academically speaking, there has to be a general sort of consensus among practitioners within philosophy, so that they can come together and form a school, and for that school to bear fruit. And I don't think that's going to happen. I do think that theism in general will come to predominate within society in the next 50 to 70 years. I do think that, precisely because the sort of atheistic philosophies that, were very popular within the 20th century, but have sort of died down now, have filtered their way into the sort of the mainstream. Usually I kind of like to think that, what's popular in philosophy takes maybe 2 or 3 generations to filter in.
There's always a lag. I agree. Right.
Yeah. And so I think right now, theism within philosophy has, a very strong impetus behind it. You have lots of different theistic philosophers, all in one way or another defending theism. And I think 50 to 70 years, a couple of generations, that will filter down.
We'll feel the effects of that in culture.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah.
Because when you think about it, students of theistic philosophers who maybe do masters or doctorates with them, but don't go into philosophy, but go into the media, go into journalism, go into teaching, teaching in, primary schools, secondary schools, go into public life, they're all going to retain that philosophical influence. And so in that way, I think theism will permeate into society.
Yeah, good stuff. William says, Gavin, are you planning to update your blog anytime soon?
Yeah. So that was the Bearded Thomist blog. Look, I started that, and when things get really heavy, that's the last thing that that I look at. So I mean, I'm not like Pat here. Social media is, this is the thing, this is your bread and butter, Pat. My bread and butter is, I'm an academic philosopher. So my primary task is to teach my students and to research and publish. So the blog takes a back seat. Maybe if I wasn't invited on so many podcasts,
I know it's my fault.
I would. I kind of feel that my social media engagement, gets a good sort of, representation by all the podcasts I'm invited to do.
Yeah, well, I'm with you too. It's just hard to find the time to write the blog. So whenever I blog now, it's usually just something very, very short and sweet. And I'm not even teaching like you, but just between the other writing commitments and just running the business and the podcast, the blog is it's just so low at the on the priority list, right? I did get up that little blog today. I got the 1-page Thomism in 1 page up.
Yeah, I saw it. Congratulations, well done.
It's 1 page. So
yeah,
big congrats there. But you got a few pieces on your blog though, right?
Yeah, I got out a few pieces on the sort of stuff that I'm interested in, and then one thing led to another, just lots of teaching, lots of marking, a real flurry of, articles being written, or articles requested to be written, books being written, books having to be reviewed, then, the small matter of COVID. It ended up just falling by the wayside, and I haven't really returned to it.
Right.
I really should, William, maybe whenever I get, those days whenever, you get everything behind you, and you get a chance to do something, those fabled sort of days, maybe one of those will come along and I might get something up.
Next question, Gavin, is what is your strongest argument against apathyism?
Apathyism?
that would be where somebody's essentially just apathetic concerning matters of God or ultimate foundations, just stuff like that, right?
Yeah. Okay. So that's really interesting. So the medievals, they talked about a kind of a vice in the spiritual life called acedia or arcadia, which is kind of like spiritual boredom, which is kind of like, apathyism. It's kind of just, meh. I don't really care. What is the strongest argument against apathyism? I'm assuming, what's the best way to break somebody out of apathyism? Would that be?
I think so. Right.
Right. I think it's not so much argumentative. You do have to have a good argument, but when somebody is apathetic, it usually requires some sort of personal touch. Why are they apathetic? You need to find some route into that person. What do they find important, and why do they not find theism important, let's say? And then it's all about kind of making the theism relate to what they find important. I've got a very good friend, I've been at a reading group with him, for the past over 10 years now. We meet up regularly. We've read nearly every major piece, in the history of analytic philosophy. We've read all the major pieces, in continental philosophy. But he's a complete atheist. He has both my books, and we've read my books and stuff. But he's an atheist. But he's an atheist not because he thinks that the arguments are wrong. It's kind of like that existential choice we were discussing earlier. He doesn't see making a decision for theism as an ongoing concern, and so he's completely apathetic. But he doesn't. There isn't this sort of spiritual boredom about him or anything like that. And I think it's just kind of, trying to find something that, that person finds important to relate, the theistic arguments to them. But apathy, I think it is a personal issue. It's not so much an intellectual issue. It's more a personal dispositional issue over anything else.
I mean, having children, suffering, and death, I found. In fact, it ties in a long way with Stump's theory of suffering in general, right? I mean, I honestly think this is one of the hardest things. I mean, a lot of people who are close to me kind of fall into this category, right? They care a lot about sports, which is always blown my mind, because for better or worse, God blessed me with an obsessive interest in like the most fundamental questions, right? Like I've never cared about sports. He's blessed me with a fundamental indifference about professional sports, like on every level. I just cannot care about them at all. And believe me, I've tried, but it's sort of the opposite of a lot of people, especially family that I surround myself. Like that's all they care about, right? And like any questions of deep existential importance just hardly seem to ever enter their mind. So this is something I personally struggle with. I don't, but I will say that I've seen people start to become concerned with these things at major life events, illnesses, having children, facing their own mortality, right? And I guess that to some extent that's to be expected. Now, whether I could have or anybody could have got them to care before these points, I don't know, but it shows again how suffering can be medicinal, or joy too. I mean, a lot of people just having their kids and experiencing this was part of my wife's conversion story. It wasn't any arguments or stuff that I gave her. It was feeling the transcendent love she had for her children and realizing she had no way to account for this in her current worldview. It made her suddenly start to really care and consider about the question of God. Right? Yeah.
It reminds me of Heidegger in Being and Time, where he talks about the forgetfulness of being, that, we philosophers, we've forgotten about the being of things. The being of beings, we're thinking about beings and we don't think about their being. And he kind of, does a bit of an archaeology of the forgetfulness of being. And we have to, again, make the being of beings a question, which is a pressing question. And I think, that expresses a kind of philosophical apathy about being. We have to, make the issue, say of theism, a pressing one. And it's usually in these major life events and existential choices that have to be made, where the question of what I really believe comes to the fore. Because most of the times, unless you are a really engaged philosopher, there's no reason to ask these sorts of major existential questions. We're oversaturated with information, so much so that asking major questions is just, it's bracketed off. It's too much. Once I get through all the information on Wikipedia and on Google, then I will be in a position to ask, major life questions, which, that's never going to happen.
Right. Well, trick of the devil there. I was one of C.S. Lewis is one of my favorite lines of him in Screw Tape Letters is like, right when somebody's about to start thinking about God's existence, give them a rumble in the tummy, right?
Yeah.
Make them hungry.
Exactly. Yeah. Introduce something else. Yeah. So there we go.
Sorry, if you wanted to continue your thoughts on that, Gavin, go ahead. We don't have to.
No, I'm grand. That would be my thoughts.
That was a really good question. So thank you for that, Harry. William says, where do you guys disagree with Aquinas?
Okay, cool. I take it the question is not, Pat, where you and I would disagree with each other, but in what has Aquinas ever sort of come off of anything that we disagree with in his thinking?
Right. Yeah.
Okay, so I'll just set aside, the outdated science.
Right. Yeah. The outdated physics and stuff. Yeah.
So
because presumably he would have amended his views if he were still around.
Yeah.
Here on that stuff.
Yeah.
Right? Yeah.
Absolutely. So just set that aside. Obviously we disagree with that. I can honestly say, aside from the Immaculate Conception stuff, aside from that, I haven't read anything in Aquinas' thought that I could say, no, I think that's wrong. And I suppose that's why I'm a Thomist. Because I think in everything that on every major philosophical issue that I've engaged with and that he has written about, I found myself being in agreement with him.
Yeah.
I can't say that about Aristotle. I can't say that about Plato. And I can't say that about Kant. And they're my other three major philosophers that I always turn to.
I agree. Yeah.
But I can say that about Aquinas.
So I'll say a few things about this. Yeah. So obviously Aquinas was off on just some of his physical theory, but what pulled me towards Aquinas was his metaphysical theory, right? And his ethics and other things like that. Where I disagree with Aquinas, it's always a conditional, right? So there's some things where I read Aquinas and I'm actually just not sure what he's saying, right? And so then I look to see what other people say he's saying. And I'll give you an example of this. Predestination, for example, right? And so what I say, so I'm not a neo-Banyesian. I've made that clear many times, right? Now, whether or not that is Aquinas' view is something I leave as a conditional, right? So, if that was Aquinas' view, then I guess I disagree with Aquinas. But there's many Thomists who say that wasn't Aquinas' view. And I agree with that, right? I'd be more broadly in line with a Maritain or somebody like that. So I guess that's how I would start to if Aquinas really did hold this position and I disagree with that position, then yes, I would just part with Aquinas on that. Of course, I'd still be with him on everything else, right? Yeah. But I'd be willing to do that too, because Aquinas isn't, he's not the church, right?
Yeah,
I'm not bound to following everything Aquinas says by any means. I think that would be ridiculous, right? I think he's a great guide, a great model. And I think he's a great model both in the way he conducts himself, the way he argues. But I also think he's a great guide in the fact that I do think he is generally right about pretty much whatever I read from him. But there are certain issues and interpretations like that where I would just be willing to say, okay, if you could really demonstrate to me that this was Aquinas' position, which I'm not convinced on, but maybe it is, then I would just say, yeah, I just part with Aquinas there. So I guess that's how I would answer something like that, right?
Yeah. And I suppose that's why for me, when I read Aquinas, and if I'm going to decide whether I agree or disagree with Aquinas, I'll stay away from those major commentators and see what Thomas himself wrote. So I'm just going to go back to the source, get an idea of what he wrote, and then go to the commentators, and then that helps me sort of, work my way through the commentators, see which commentators I like, see which commentators I don't like. I don't generally tend to do philosophy through secondary sources. I tend to do it through primary sources. Although saying that, the commentators on Thomas now are primary sources in themselves. Cajetan, Banez, Molina, if he's a Thomist. People like that, they're primary sources in themselves. But yeah, I would go to the horse's mouth first, before,
always a good policy for any philosopher, right? I mean, that was just primary text. Go right to the man himself or woman herself before that.
And then I would just be like, well, look, this is how I understand Thomas, and understanding him like this, I think I agree with him. So these commentators who understand him in a different way, let's say Gilson, on Thomistic realism, I would say, well, look, I think, that's, first of all, I think that's not right, Gilson, you're wrong there about realism. And secondly, I don't think that's Thomas. I don't think you've got Thomas right either.
Right. And I mean, some issues too that Thomas are talking about, they just weren't issues for Thomas. You know what I mean? So like some of them are just things that historically in the context just weren't stuff that Thomas was dealing with,
Yeah, and so they try to take his thinking and make it address an issue which wasn't an issue for Thomas.
Right.
And and then you can see why it wasn't an issue, because he had a different philosophical framework. And it was a principled and motivated philosophical framework. So, that's a good way of rather than showing how Thomas is able to respond to a contemporary issue. Better to do the whole sort of deflationary thing and show how, well, really the Thomistic position can dissolve the contemporary issue and show it to be a non-issue. Right.
Yeah, that's very good. Good point. All right, Harry, I see your other questions, but I want to make sure we get through some of the other listeners, and then we'll circle back to yours here. They're all very good. But William says, any other arguments for God's existence aside from Aquinas's that you guys think are successful?
Okay, so what I see as unifying all of Aquinas's arguments for God is the move from what is per aliud, what is through another, or per participationem, what exists in a participative manner, to what is per se, to what exists in itself. And I think that unifies all Aquinas's arguments for God's existence. For me, that's Thomas's way to God.
Right. There is just the argument for God.
Yeah. And then that's manifest in lots of different ways, but they all deploy that per aliud to the per se inference. Okay, so I think, and I think that demonstration for God's existence is successful. Have I come across any other arguments that I think are successful that Aquinas doesn't use? So that really to me is, are there any arguments which don't employ the per aliud to per se inference that I think are successful? No, precisely because let's talk about what we mean by successful. Do we mean like metaphysically demonstrative, or do we mean like highly plausible? So I think that would maybe help for this question. Yeah. What's the standard here? What's the bar? Right. For me, the standard has to be metaphysically demonstrative. Right. So it has to be a demonstrative proof. And to me, the moving from the per aliud to the per se, given the metaphysics that I endorse, that's the only way that we could get to God, because all creatures are through another in some sort of fashion. They're deficient in their being in some sort of way, so they depend on what is per se being, or what exists per se, and they participate in that in order to be. So I think that the only demonstrative argumentation can be that kind of argumentation. So the various other arguments, design, ontological, various cosmological, Kantian, from concerns about justice and morality, I just don't think work, because they're all put forth in within a philosophical or a metaphysical framework that I wouldn't endorse. Right. So let's take another example, a common one, the Clam argument, right? Which Aquinas famously rejected. What are your? Because I would say, I think in terms of like metaphysical demonstration, I agree with everything you've just said. Yeah. However, I don't think the Clam argument's worthless, and I think a lot of the recent developments in it, especially with stuff like that Kuhns and Proust have been doing with causal finitism and stuff, I think at least make the argument, like, to me, convincing and highly plausible. Maybe it doesn't fit into the same category as a metaphysical demonstration. Other people would say philosophically, in terms of the philosophical arguments for the infinite past,
Yeah, I'm not convinced, or against the finitude of, or for the finitude of the universe. I'm not convinced, but if we take the scientific evidence there, that gives us a certain probability, and then we have a probabilistic argument, right? Again, not a metaphysical demonstration, but it's a probabilistic argument, and in terms of like weights in a scale, it serves a function. I'm somewhat sympathetic with that line of thought, as long as those qualifications are made. I'd be curious your opinion.
Yeah. Okay, so bearing in mind that the question asked other arguments that we think are successful, not worthless, so successful. I would say about the Clam argument, the general form of the Clam argument is to reason for a first cause, given that there is a beginning of things, and so there's some cause for that beginning. And as traditionally put forward, I think Clam cosmological arguments fail to show that first cause is the cause without which nothing would be. So I think they fail to show that, you know, that first cause is a creator, whereas I think what Thomas's arguments do in showing that there's a cause which per se exists, and on which anything which in any way exists depends for its existence, gives us a creator, and so gives us God. Now, it could be that developments of the Clam cosmological argument as developed by Proust and Kuhns and taken in, you know, considerations of essentially ordered series do establish that first cause is something, is that on which everything depends in order to be. And what I would say to that, well, that then entails that what you have is a move from beings which are per aliud to a being which is per se. And so it would mean that Clam argument really is deploying that kind of argumentation that Aquinas deploys. And so it would be more or less the same kind of argument that Aquinas is using, which I think is successful.
Right, just a different starting point. You know, it's interesting. This will tie back into what we said before about whether an argument will convince somebody to change their worldview. It's funny because I think maybe you would agree with this. Like the arguments that we probably think are the most successful, the true metaphysical demonstrations, are probably the least successful in terms of like popular persuasive ability, right? Like what I've seen like really gets people to reconsider or think about theism are things like, for example, like the physical fine-tuning argument. Like that really like surprises people when they hear about the fine-tuning of the constants and quantities and stuff like that. Like they kind of make this, and I guess because it's kind of easy to make that grasp and to kind of make the conceptual leap between fine-tuning and a fine-tuner and stuff like that. So I guess part of it's just probably just ease or accessibility, but it's kind of an interesting thing, right? That it's kind of like that inverse going on, right, between like what we think is most successful in actual demonstrating God's existence versus what might be most useful or persuasive in just trying to get somebody to see the plausibility of theism in the general public or something like that, right?
Yeah, I think that's right, and it's a good observation, and it sort of highlights the difference between what Thomas is doing in a demonstration for God's existence. He's not just, you know, trying to find an argument and just leaving it at that. He's working out a systematic metaphysics, and within that metaphysics, you know, within that philosophy of being, you have a demonstration for God's existence. So that demonstration for God's existence can never be divorced from the metaphysical backdrop within which it occurs. Any attempt to represent Aquinas's arguments for God's existence independently of the metaphysical backdrop is just not Aquinas. So you just can't do that. So because you'll be misrepresenting Thomas. Whereas within an apologetical context, you can do that. You don't need all that metaphysics. You know, we've got this good persuasive argument here. So, you know, what Thomas is doing is an academic philosophical enterprise, and what apologetics is doing will involve philosophy. You know, you need to kind of have your philosophical wits about you to do apologetics, but it's going to be much more trying to find a persuasive route to bring this person to the sort of truth that you've already sort of realized yourself.
Yeah, very good. Next one's from Andrew. We got this question last time, Gavin, but we can certainly jam on it again. He wants to know your thoughts on corruptionism And do you agree with the central thesis? And then also, how would you simplify the hylomorphic view of the soul to someone who's just not familiar with philosophy? How would you explain it to the man in the street, if you will?
Yeah. So corruptionism, that's the idea that, that the person corrupts upon death. Isn't that right? So doesn't survive.
The person doesn't survive, but the soul does.
Yeah. So the person is a composite of body and soul. So the person, is physical substance, and the rational soul survives the corruption of the body, precisely because the rational soul, as the form of the body, is immaterial. So the active existence which the soul gives to the body, is not lost when the body is lost. So the soul survives with its active existence. Now, my view is that insofar as the active existence is individuated to the individual whose act it is, and that's the individual person, the body-soul composite, the soul in losing its body doesn't lose its individual active existence, so it retains its individuality as the individual soul that it is. So it's the individual person's soul that remains. So something that the person remains. It's an incomplete person, but it's still an individual person's soul that remains, so that whenever it's reunited with its body, the person will be completed once again. Now, whether that contradicts the central thesis of corruptionism, I certainly don't think that the person is corrupt, precisely because that person's individual soul remains. I mean, that could, disagree with the central thesis of corruptionism, but I mean, certainly, I do think the person to some extent, in an incomplete manner, survives death, and I would suggest that that's enough to avoid corruptionism. Although I imagine there are many different shades of corruptionism. So, I mean, that could be classified as a corruptionist sort of thesis. Do you want to add anything to that, Pat?
Just that I am still working on getting Chris Tomaszewski, who's doing his PhD on this very subject on the podcast again soon, and this will be the topic. So if you're interested in this, just keep an eye out for that. We're just trying to work the scheduling, which is always tricky, but so that's coming up. Nothing else to add. I agree with what you say. So how would you simplify the idea of the hylomorphic view of the soul to somebody?
Yeah. So the first thing, what you have to do is you need to simplify matter form composition, and the way that I've always found in doing that. So we get a lot of students in who, they're taking academic philosophy because of some other course in life that they're taking. But it's not because they want to be academic philosophers. So they literally are, the men in the street, coming in to philosophy firsthand. So that when I'm teaching Aristotle to them, I kind of need to simplify hylomorphism, first of all. And I typically use the example of the statue of David, and you distinguish, between the matter and the form of David, the form being the shape of David, the matter being the marble of David, pointing out how the marble stands in potency to the form, but the marble could have been something else. So the actuality that the marble takes is determined by the form. So I do all of that. And then so in doing that, I like to give them a good sort of grounding in the distinction between matter and form. And then when we get to issues of the soul, I say, well, look, think about living and non-living things. Okay, living things are not non-living things, and vice versa. So what distinguishes them? They are distinguished from each other. So what is it that distinguishes them? It can't be their matter, because they're both material. Okay, living and non-living things, they've got their matter in common. So it can't be the matter that distinguishes them. Rather, it's how the matter is put together. And given that we've just looked at matter form composition, I then invite, the students to kind of get the insight. Well, how is it that what is it that forms the matter? And they're like, well, it's the form. And I'm like, yes, right. So it's the form which distinguishes living from non-living things. So living things have a special form which non-living things don't have. And that form is the soul. And then we go through the different, gradations of soul. So that's the way I would do it.
Right. And that sounds like very well rehearsed, like you're a professor or something.
Like I've been teaching it for over 10 years.
For a while. Yeah. Excellent. Very good. Seth has a question. How are human beings culpable for their actions given a Thomistic metaphysics of the will?
Well, I mean, I think it's because they make the choice for a particular action in the knowledge that it's an evil action.
Right. And I think this question is getting at, sometimes there's the objection, right, that all evil has to come from ignorance, right? So how can it be culpable? But it overlooks an important distinction, which Thomas was very clued in on. And there's a recent book on this out by, I think it's Stephen Jensen. It's called Thomistic Psychology of Sin, right? That we can make ourselves ignorant, right? There's a voluntary ignorance that we can engage in, right? We can choose not to consider what we habitually know to pursue what is the apparent good versus true good. So it's because of the voluntary ignorance, right? Our ability to not consider the moral rule, even though we know it habitually, right? That's where culpability could come in. So it's a critical distinction, I think, that cannot be overlooked, right?
And we see that played out all the time, you know, when we make decisions, when we make bad decisions, you know, let's say you make a decision to go out, you know, you go out to the bar with your friends, and you know that if you start hitting the whiskeys, that, you know, you're gonna have a rough night and a rough morning the next day. But
this wasn't news to you, right? You know this,
but then you're kind of like, oh, you know, and so you focus your attention on the whiskeys and you forget about that. You know, that it's not going to end up too well, and you know that's a problem for future Gavin. That's not a problem for present Gavin. And then that's, you know, we say that's a bad decision, and so when you wake up with a hangover, you know, it's just like, well, you brought it on yourself. You're responsible for that, and that kind of decision making is very common, where we sort of suspend, you know, that knowledge that we have about the truth of the matter, the true good in the situation, and we focus on the apprehended good, the not quite proper good, and allow that to guide our decision making.
We make a judgment without the rule in hand. And we knew the rule, so we don't consider the rule, and we don't use the rule when we could have, like we really could have. That's why it's culpable, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
Because choosing not to, and God gave us everything we needed to use the rule, to keep the rule in hand. Now, again, we've talked about this before. We did a kind of deeper dive on this, right? Is that we don't always have to have the rule in hand, right? Because we don't have to always consider everything all at once. That would be impossible. But we do have to keep the rule in hand. And by that, I mean the moral rule in mind as it relates to some particular judgment when we make the judgment, right? So when I make the judgment to drive after having 5 or 6 whiskeys, I have failed, right? Because I knew previously that I should not drive. Pat Flynn should not drive after having even 2 whiskeys. Being frank, right? And Pat Flynn knows this very well. But you can always choose not to look, not to consider, right? And focus your attention on other things. So the key there is we can engage in a voluntary ignorance. And that's something that's often overlooked. But it's just like, if you just reflect on experience, you know it's true. If you're honest with yourself, you know you've done that. We've all done that. We know that we failed, right? If we're being honest. And we tell ourselves that, like, I knew better, right? We tell ourselves that all the time, right? So like, this is just it's so obvious. It doesn't even need that much philosophical reflection. It's good that you have that deeper analysis, but when you're just honest with yourself, you just know that you just can engage in this voluntary ignorance, right? Good question. All right, let me scroll back up here. ND Irish has a comment. He says, dragons in the West also protect the gold virtue that the knight must find.
So they're protectors of virtue, are they?
How about that?
Well, Smaug certainly wasn't a very, sort of virtuous dragon in protecting the gold. Maybe that was Tolkien's kind of, anti-dragon agenda. Right.
Here's the next question. What are y'all's thoughts on atheistic philosophical foundations? For example, the universe being necessary, or just a brute fact.
Yeah. So, I mean, I think explanations like that, they revolve around a metaphysics which is atomistic. So the idea is that you have these atomic components, and the different things that exist are really just different configurations of these atomic components. So they kind of have that metaphysics in mind. And so the atomic components are necessary, or just brute. We've reached metaphysical bedrock there. I don't find that sort of metaphysics plausible. I don't think that's the way things are composed. I don't think Werner Heisenberg has a great book. I almost said Walter Heisenberg there. So Werner Heisenberg, he's got a great book. I think it's called Physics and Philosophy. We're in the chapter "What is Matter?" He sort of points out how contemporary physics is coming to view, at least in his opinion, is coming to a more Aristotelian account of matter. I think the Aristotelian account of how things are composed is a better metaphysical account. The one in terms of matter and form. And given that account of the composition of things, and then locating that within the deeper Thomistic account of the composition of essence and existence, I don't think anything in which essence and existence are composed, or which is a composite of matter and form, can be necessary in the way that these atheist philosophical foundations would say it's necessary, or a brute fact, because it'll always require some cause ultimately being founded in per se cause.
Right. Yeah. I'll just build on a little bit of what you said. Just calling something necessary isn't much of an explanation, right? In fact, if you just call something necessary, it seems to cry out for even more of an explanation, right? So I don't think just like deeming it's necessary, problem solved. No, like that isn't really much of an explanation. What we want to know is, how could anything be necessary in the first place, right? And it seems like we do need at least some necessary thing to explain why there's any contingent thing rather than not, granted. But just going around and just calling something necessary, again, doesn't seem like much of an explanation. Now, Thomism and traditional metaphysics has a good answer to that, right? The only thing that could be necessary is that which has no distinction between what it is, its essence, and the fact that it is existence. It is purely actual, subsistent being itself, absolutely simple, not composed of parts, right? So the Thomist says, look, there's certain aspects of reality that point outside of itself for an explanation of why it is instead of not, right? Things that are composite, essence, existence, matter, form, physically, metaphysically, for example. So if we're going to get to anything that's necessary, which granted, it seems like we do need to, it's only going to be that which is purely actual, right? And that's going to be one, it's going to be only one, and it's going to be God, and all of absolute divine simplicity. Like, you get the whole suite of classical theism with it. So this isn't just a criticism for atheists. This is a criticism for theists who aren't classical theists as well, and just call God necessary, but don't give a deeper explanation of why God is necessary. To me, it seems perfectly legitimate then, like, if you're just calling something necessary without giving a deeper explanation, the atheist could say to that type of theist, well, the universe is just necessary, right? Like, we need some deeper principled reason of why something could be necessary in the first place. And I think the only good reason, the only right reason, is the classical theist position, right? That Gaven explained. And then brute facts, I have a hard time as I get older and crustier, and I know people say that I look like I'm 25 years old now that I shaved the beard, but I am getting older. I guess I find it harder to take that position seriously at all. I think it does absolute destruction to reason. I think the types of retorsion arguments against brute facts are good and strong, right? The world obviously does not seem to operate if brute facts were possible or the case. Yeah, I think it obliterates the PSR, in which case we kind of lose the basis for all reasoning, all science whatsoever. And it has always just struck me, and still strikes me, as an exceedingly ad hoc maneuver where like theism starts coming on the scene as the ultimate cash out explanation, and then suddenly, bam, brute facts come, right? Bam, brute facts. I think if you're going to go the brute fact route, you better be willing to accept just like absurdity and absurdism all the way through. Yeah.
One thing I would add is that the sort of kind of theistic arguments that I would defend don't make the argumentative move that you need necessary being to explain contingent being. And I think maybe what some atheistic philosophical foundations do is just say, well, look, if you need necessity to explain contingency, why can't, something non-divine be necessary? I mean, my attitude here is that, well, I'm not making that move that you need necessity to explain contingency. I'm saying you need something per se to explain what's per valued. And then after we do that, we'll ask ourselves, is what is per se necessary? But you don't get the necessity in there by needing it to explain contingency.
Yeah, and I'm thinking of those. I'm not thinking of contingency in the way that no, I'm with you. I see what you're saying. So I'm saying, like, there are things that are, their existence is caused, right? They don't exist in virtue of what they are. And to explain those types of things, we do have to get back to that which exists in virtue of what it is. And then as it happens, once we find that thing, it just will be necessary. But we will already have found the deeper explanation for its necessity, right? Yeah. So necessity kind of like follows from non-compositeness, pure actuality in the Thomist tradition, rather than first pointing at that we need something necessary and then unpacking it. So yeah, all your points are appreciated there. We're not in any disagreement. Yeah. ND Irish is, what are your guys' thoughts on Pascal's wager? Gavin, this might actually be a spot where we maybe disagree a little bit.
Yeah, you asked me this, I think a while, it was about a year ago. Somebody asked me this. I really don't have much thoughts on Pascal's wager. I don't really see it as, very, very useful, sort of, well, which bet are you going to place? Well, I mean, if you kind of go with the God horse, if you're wrong, well, still, it's still a good bet to make. If you're right, still a good bet to make. So why wouldn't you make it? I suppose I just don't think about, issues pertaining to God in philosophy in that kind of way. As we were sort of mentioning earlier, I'm somebody for, sort of demonstrative proof rather than these more persuasive sort of plausibility kinds of scenarios. But I know you think differently, Pat, on this.
Yeah, I don't know, again, how substantial our disagreement is. Michael Rhoda has a good book called Taking Pascal's Wager. And it's funny because he kind of does, I guess, some of the more likely to be persuasive on a popular level arguments, right? So he gives like a fine-tuning argument type of thing and just tries to show that like the idea of God is at least plausible, right? I don't know. I guess he kind of does that. And then he introduces Pascal's wager in a contemporary form. And I think, let me just try and explain it how he does. It's been a while since I read the book, so the details are a little foggy. But what Rhoda wants to say is this. He says Pascal's wager isn't something that can just like answer all the questions, right? It's something that needs to come in at the right time. So it's not something that can, tell you what religion is true by any means. Rather, he says the wager should come in at a specific instance when somebody is like undecided 50-50 on atheism or Christianity. So say they've already looked at the arguments, right? They've looked at the arguments for God. They've tried to roll up their sleeves and look at the historical credibility, and they've done as much intellectual work as they could possibly do for themselves, and they've gotten to a position where they are just stuck, right? They just feel like, yeah, it's either atheism or Christianity, 50-50, and that's just the position they're in, right? So they've eliminated other options, but this is where they're at. That's when Rhoda says this is when somebody should consider Pascal's wager. And there's the traditional considerations, right? Of yes, it'll be pleasing to God. You could have eternal friendship with God. This will help you perfect morally if this moral system is true. So like a lot of upsides there. If you're wrong, you won't know it. No big deal, right? But Rhoda does a nice job of bringing in contemporary psychological and sociological research of the benefits of being religious in this life, not just the next life. And I thought that was kind of a nice act because Pascal didn't have that research at his time, right? And one of the kind of pushbacks to Pascal's wager traditionally has been like, well, you might miss out on a lot of fun in this life, right? Or something like that. But actually, research shows that you'll probably be happier in this life if you're religious, or at least generally spiritual, religious, than not. And there does also seem to be a causal directionality too. It isn't just that happier people tend to be religious. Actually, becoming and conversion tends to help with anxiety, depression, mental health, all these things, right? So then Rhoda says, okay, now that we have all the stakes set, right, and you're 50-50, it's like seeing the pros and cons of what you have to gain versus what you have to lose in this life and possibly the next. The absolutely rational thing to do here is not, and this is key, not to fake belief, because you can't fake belief. And this is the big qualification he makes. He says the rational thing to do at this point is to begin a life of religious seeking, right? So read the Bible, hang out with people like Gavin, go to Bible studies, sit in at a mass, right? Pray to God, and even in an agnostic way. God, if there is a God, save my soul if I have a soul. So he's saying you don't do anything inauthentic, because it's inauthentic, right? But it becomes highly rational at this point, if you're in that position, to at least pursue a line of religious seeking. And that, to me, I think that's cool. That sounds like a useful thing that might serve some people who really feel like they're just stuck at that position, right? For whatever reason. I don't know if you disagree with that. Feel free, Gavin, to push back. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it seems to me that's all very good practical advice. What I suppose maybe I'll just kind of be a wee bit pushy and ask, where's the philosophy? So it seems, it's good, pragmatic, practical advice to give to somebody who is seeking. But what sort of philosophical work are we doing here? To me, philosophical work, it's metaphysics, it's epistemology,
right?
It's logic, it's ethics. This sort of thing, I don't know. It just seems it's what could you call it? Philosophical pragmatics, how we apply philosophy in our day-to-day living, and what would be the best sort of decision to make in our day-to-day living.
Yeah, I mean that's a really good question. I guess I would respond with another question, right? There's obviously going to be people, and it's probably most people, right, who are caught up in culture, who either don't have the time, and not to sound rude, but they don't have either the intelligence or the specialization to evaluate the philosophical arguments, right? So what do you do with them, right? Like they're really stuck. Like, I've read Kerr's book, and it seems good, but I can't really make all that much sense of it. And then I read another atheist, and he's real smart, and I just don't know, right? And they feel really overwhelmed. So what would you say to somebody like that, right?
So when I'm dealing with people like that, I mean, it's not in the mode of a philosopher; it's in the mode of a Dominican. Okay, so I'm acting, as the preacher, as sort of somebody, who is getting to know them personally and trying to figure out how best I could advise them. But I'm not doing philosophy, because philosophy for me, it's in the classical mode, it's a science, where we're trying to have a procedure for gaining knowledge about a particular subject matter. Whereas the sort of question, you're asking, well, that's, how do we preach to this person? Really, it's that classic Dominican thing of, how do we preach? How do we take care of, this person's soul? And I wouldn't deny that, Pascal and others, have something to say here. I would just say that it's not philosophy that they're doing.
Sure. Yeah, that's. I mean, I'm with you. I do philosophy not to be an apologist. I mean, I've me, I've resisted the term apologist, even though I write for Catholic Answers or Word of Fire, so it's attached to me. But I'm like not right. If you like push me on a lot of like nitty-gritty historical apologetics questions of like certain councils, I'm not going to have the answer to that, right? Because that's not what I'm doing. I'm like you, I'm trying to do philosophy, right? So I'm not that, and that isn't to downplay apologists out there. Some of them are brilliant and they're doing good work. It's just not the role I'm serving. And when I tell people, when people ask me questions, I'm like, hey, I'll show you what convinced me, or this or that. But for me, philosophy always interested me for its own sake, because I wanted to know what was true for me first and foremost, not to convince anybody else. Right.
Yeah.
Good stuff. Go ahead if you had another comment you wanted to add to that.
No, I didn't. No.
Cool. All right, let me scroll back up and see where we're at with the questions here. Lots of good questions, guys. This is good stuff. All right. Trying to make sure I haven't missed any here. Let me just highlight this. Saul says, cheers from Minnesota. He's sipping decaf, prepping for the gym. Pat's looking 10 years younger, minus the beard. Well, I knew I was going to be talking to Brian and Gavin, and they both rock a pretty strong beard game. So I was trying not to, again, rush into making myself look foolish. So I just decided to trim up a bit.
How come he's sipping decaf before the gym?
It is strange, isn't it?
Yeah, that's not much of a pre-workout.
How you were? Here's a question from me.
Yeah.
What have you been doing workout wise lately, Gavin?
Workout wise. So I've been lifting weights, and doing a lot of conditioning. So the weights, I've been lifting. I've been staying in the low reps. The past few days I've been staying in the low reps. But I think, soon enough I'll be getting up into the hypertrophy range, again. And then I've just been doing a lot of conditioning work. So a workout I did the other day, I found it in the CrossFit website and it looked fun, was to put on a weight vest and to do 100 lunges, along with 300-meter sprints for 4 rounds. So so that lasted a while. Doing martial arts training, and so it's weights, conditioning, martial arts training.
Awesome. Yeah, great.
Yeah,
we'll have to do an extended episode on just those themes by itself at some point.
That would be cool.
In the meantime, Left Terrace, if I'm pronouncing this right, hello to you, good sir. I know we're connected on Facebook. He says, his question is this: on natural theology grounds, besides scripture, why do you think theism is better than deism?
Yeah. So I'm assuming what he means by theism here is that God has a concern for creation. He doesn't just create and leave creatures to their own devices. That there is some sort of concern that God has. Well, the first thing that I'll say is that for anything to exist at any point at which it exists, it has to participate in God's existence. Okay, it derives its existence from God. So right now, things are deriving their existence from God, and I think that really undermines deism, because deism seems to suggest that God sort of throws things into existence and then takes a step back and just leaves them through.
Goes off to more seemly recreations, right?
Yeah. But the fact on the Thomistic account that any moment at which anything exists, it's participating in existence which it derives from God. It means that for as long as anything exists, it's continually present to God. But now we want more than that. Okay, so and I'm assuming that this question suggests we want more than that. We want God to have some sort of active concern for creatures. And this is a position that I defended in my creation book, that God does have a special concern for creatures, because on the account of creation that I defended, God's motivation for creation is the love that he has for himself. Okay, so it's he sees the divine essence as good, and then creatures are willed as non-necessary ends for God's willing of his divine essence. So he wills creatures to exist so that they can enjoy the goodness of the divine essence, i.e. that they can enjoy existence. So nothing would exist were not God not to love it into existence. So things exist precisely because they are loved by God. And I think that just totally, undermines deism. You just can't have deism out of that. So, that gives us the sort of theism, which I suppose, which the question is looking for, because it says, besides scripture. So does it want that kind of scriptural sort of theism, the sort of theism that's borne witness to in scripture? Well, here you have in Thomism an account of creatures that holds that they exist precisely because God loves them.
Right.
So any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I've got a lot of thoughts. I'm just deciding if I should share them because I don't know if they'll annoy you or not.
Right.
No, I think it's metaphysically demonstrative that it's theism and not deism. But if you want more weight, and if you want, again, maybe they're not demonstrative, but also not completely worthless arguments, Stephen Meyer's book, Return of the God Hypothesis, literally puts out competing hypotheses, theism, deism, atheism, whatever, and makes a general cumulative case for theism on many different counts. So you have that. And, there's other, you just call them evidences. And I always like to leave it up to people for their own investigation. You can decide how much weight each of this evidence is in the scale for you. Again, I think it's already metaphysically demonstrated, so you might not need this, but things like near-death experiences and stuff that we've talked about before seem to show that God definitely has a concern. And I like how you put it, because concern is a good way of putting it, Gavin, because I guess somebody could see deism as the idea that God just kind of flicks things into existence. He sort of flicks the first domino and he kind of steps back, and I don't know, puts his proverbial feet up or something like that.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm trying to think if somebody could be a robust classical theist and still say that God doesn't have a concern. And I'm actually thinking no. I don't think that's possible. I think that those commitments are kind of bound together, right? That when God wills things, he is quite literally loving them into existence by giving them the good of existence as such. So I don't even know if there's any room in there to try and eliminate the idea of concern from a classical theistic conception.
Yeah, no, I mean, there's nothing much that I would have to add there.
Yeah. But then, of course, if you do take scripture seriously and think that God has kind of gone on something of a rescue mission here, it's all the more reason to not be a deist, right?
Sorry, you just cut out there. Didn't quite catch that bit.
I said, am I back now? Can you hear it now?
Yeah.
I just said, no, if you do take scripture seriously and you think God has gone on something of a rescue mission, then you have very good reason to be a theist. Seth wants to know, what is your favorite argument in favor of hylomorphism?
Yeah. So there's a few considerations that sort of lead me to affirm hylomorphism. The first is the Platonic and Aristotelian reaction to the standoff between Heraclitus and Parmenides, and the idea that the being is a plurivocal or analogical notion, and so we need some account of the degrees of being. And whilst Plato has a very nice account, with the divided line and the forms and all that, I think Aristotle's account on act and potency gets at what Plato was trying to get at, that we need to include potency in being in order to have the sort of degrees of being that we have. But if we have potency, we need a corresponding principle of actuality. So the beings that exist are actualized potencies. Now, what is the principle of potency then? Well, it's matter. And what is the principle of actuality? Which then it is form. Higher matter and form then related. And what Aristotle does is he looks at, becoming, and analyzes becoming. And he sort of argues that, what sort of, in a sense, subsists or remains through a process of becoming is the matter taking on a different form. So you've got that hylomorphic composition of matter and form, which explains that process of becoming. And then with that in place, we can do a metaphysical analysis of that, of substances that's constituted as act potency composites comprised of matter and form.
Right, and substance accident. Yeah, I think that is the argument, right? And I talked about this with Brian, like it's, choose your philosophy. Do you want a philosophy that explains experience or explains it away? Right. Hylomorphism gives us a good, robust theory that actually helps us to explain what we really know is the case, right? That we have identity through change. We have becoming this or that, right? It makes that reality intelligible to us. Other accounts don't. They cause you to deny some radical aspect of experience. And, that's a cost. And it's good just to make costs known, if nothing else, right?
Yeah. But anyway, that's why I would endorse the hylomorphic point of view as opposed to others.
Yeah, and then related question: what would you say is the best introductory work to hylomorphism from
St. Thomas Aquinas on the Principles of Nature?
There you go. Yeah, he's got that and On Being and Essence are his two kind of philosophy of nature books. So
yeah.
Seth Johnson says, all right, always a good question here. How do we say that there is a real distinction between Father and Son without compromising divine simplicity? Yes, the Trinity and simplicity, always a fantastically thorny topic. Yeah.
So first of all, just on a doctrinal point of view, so not so much on the philosophical theological or the systematic theological point of view, but the doctrinal point of view. Pat, could you just pull the question up again?
Sorry. Yeah. I scrolled down too far. This will take a minute. Yeah.
Just on the doctrinal point of view, we have to say that there is a real distinction between the Father and the Son, because if we didn't say there's a real distinction between the Father and the Son, we end up in an early heresy known as modalism or Sabellianism, that the Father and the Son are really just manifestations or modes of the being of God. Anybody wants a nice explanation of modalism, look up St. Patrick's Bad Analogies. on YouTube. You'll get a laugh.
That's a funny video. Yeah.
Yeah. So that's just on the doctrinal point of view, but systematically speaking, how do we account for this? I mean, we can't, doing the philosophy of God, we can't just say, well, look, there's what the dogma is, or there's what the doctrine is, and we just have to leave it at that. So how do we account for this? The members of the Trinity are distinct by relation. Okay, so they're relationally distinct from each other. Okay, so the Son is distinct from the Father by relation, of paternity and filiation. And insofar as you have that oppositional relation, you have distinction. But they're not distinct. Those relations don't bear relation to the divine essence. Okay, so the relations have relation to each other, but they don't bear relation to the divine essence. So whilst there is real distinction from each other, there's not real distinction from the divine essence, because the relations aren't related to the divine essence. They're just related to each other.
If you want to check out a little bit more in depth on that, go to our conversation on Michael Lofton's Reason and Theology. We did a whole episode defending divine simplicity, and the Trinity came up at one point. That was a fun one. We'll be back on Reason and Theology, I think, end of this month, talking fifth way, right?
Well, the very question, we will be back talking on the fifth way, but just the guy that raised the question, Thomas actually deals with this in question 28 of the first part of the Summa Theologiae, whether or not the divine relations are real relations, and whether or not they're distinct from each other. And the answer I just gave is more or less that Thomistic approach.
Right. Seth says, please don't stop doing these videos. You and Gavin are awesome. Thanks, okay. Seth. Appreciate it.
Thank you, Jeff.
Yeah, guys, if you get value out of this, I mean, we love doing it, and it's always super appreciative of Gavin here. It's so cool. Please like it. Please share it. Please subscribe on the podcast. Please leave the reviews. All that stuff really helps. So we appreciate you guys. Seth says, how do we know that the God of the fifth way is the same as the God of the first, second, third, and fourth ways? So what's the link? What's the link here, Gavin?
So the link is that move from what is per aliud, or what is through another, to what is per se. I published an article in the Thomist on the fifth way, arguing that Thomas makes that move in the fifth way. That whereas the other ways are thinking in terms of efficient causality. So what is per aliud, depending on a primary in terms of efficient causality. So a primary efficient cause in essentially ordered series. I argued in the fifth way, again, we have essentially ordered series and the move from the per aliud to the per se, but we have it in terms of final causality, or the causality of the good. And so insofar as we arrive at a primary cause which is per se, we have the same primary cause from the earlier ways. So, right. So that's an article that I published in the Thomist on the fifth way.
And let me remind the gentle listeners that we have a pretty mega series on the 5 ways that we did with Carlo Broussard. That was probably over a year ago now.
It was, yeah.
But yeah, if you search the podcast and if you just type in 5 ways, Gavin Kerr, Pat Flynn, that'll pop. And we go through each of the 5 ways in pretty significant depth. So if you haven't seen that, I would recommend checking it out. All right. So Don has kind of the same question that we took up before. I don't know if there's anything else we want to add to this about ignorance factoring into every sin.
I don't think so. I mean, we kind of addressed that earlier.
Yeah. If there's anything else you want us to build on that, Don, just let us know. This seems to be a repeat question. Leftera says, is there any possible world where Gavin can be cooler than, or someone can be cooler than Gavin?
No, just to point out, I'm not a fan of possible worlds and stuff. So, is there any possibility that there's somebody in this world which is cooler than me? Yeah, absolutely. And in fact, it's not just a possibility; it's an actuality. There's lots of cooler people than me.
I don't know, man. You've got we like generalists on this show, and Gavin checks a lot of the generalist boxes. So okay. Generalists are pretty cool. Eric says, I have no idea. This is just a comment going. That's cool. You guys can have your chats in the comment section, but I'm going to just highlight the questions here. So Parisa, if I'm pronouncing that right, says, are there different schools of critical realism, and how do they differ? And are you familiar with the work of Roy Bhaskar?
Yeah, yeah. So there are different schools of critical realism, because there are a lot of, realist philosophers that want to answer the Kantian critical problem. So I mean, we have the Thomistic school, and even within the Thomistic school, we've got Marshall, we've got Lonergan. Well, Marshall and Lonergan are those that really stick out in my mind. I would also say that McDowell is something of a critical realist, but and he's not within the Thomistic school. But you do have lots of different schools. I have heard of Roy Bhaskar. A friend of mine that was a student with me while I was doing my doctorate was doing work on Roy Bhaskar. He was doing work on Roy Bhaskar, and also a reformed thinker, Dutch Calvinist called Herman Dooyeweerd. I think the name was Herman Dooyeweerd. And I think there might have been a connection. He suggested there was a connection between Lonergan and Herman Dooyeweerd. So I've heard of these individuals, and I remember my student buddy engaging with me in Lonergan and the Thomists on this. But beyond that, I haven't engaged with their thought.
Right. I'm a big Lonergan fan, so I'll just say that.
So, Parisa, if you can recommend anything by Bhaskar, please do.
All right, let's see. Eleftherios wants to know, why did God choose to create physical on top of immaterial beings?
Yeah. So, I mean, you're asking me, for the, God's inner mind. Sorry, I don't have, direct revelation of God's inner mind. I can explain why it's fitting, that God created physical as well as immaterial beings, and this is the great chain of being.
That's right. Yeah.
Yeah. That when you have the physical and the immaterial beings, and then you have human beings with a foot in each, one foot in the immaterial and one foot in material, you kind of have this perfect manifestation of all the different levels of being, with God at the highest level. So it is quite fitting that you have these, but why did God choose it? Well, we'll have to ask God that.
I'm just linking a recent article I did for Catholic Answers that talks about the chain of being. So if anybody's interested in that, it's there.
Yeah, I kind of go into the great chain of being in the last chapter of my creation book. Same, more or less the same thing. But asking why God chose to do something, well, that's God's inner motivations. So
yeah. God willing, we'll get a chance to ask. Callum says, what does Gavin think of the formal distinction? Would it undermine the real distinction?
I'm not sure what Callum is referring to there with the formal distinction. Could that be Scotus? Scotus in the formal distinction?
That's my hunch, but
So as I understand it, Scotus makes the formal distinction in order to say that whilst these two realities are distinct, they're only distinct as forms within the thing itself. So you have the form, which is the quiddity of the thing, and you have the form, which is the hecate of the thing. So Peter is human because of his humanity, but he's Peter because of his Peterness. They are formally distinct, but they're objectively formally distinct in the thing, and they're inseparable. Aquinas would have just called that a real distinction. So that's the distinction between supposite and nature in Peter. So that's just a real distinction when it comes to essence and the existence. Then essence and existence don't have to be separate or separable in order to be distinct from each other. They just have to be non-identical to each other.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I think that's always a good thing to emphasize, that just, obviously if things can be separated, that's sufficient for a real distinction, but it's not necessary, right?
Yeah. And as memory serves me, Joseph Owens, in his book, The Doctrine of Being and the Aristotelian Metaphysics, I think, as memory serves me, engaged with Aquinas and Scotus on the objective formal distinction. And he did argue that there's not much of a disagreement there. My understanding is that what Scotus takes to be the objective formal distinction, Aquinas would have just called a real distinction. But it's been years since I've engaged with that book, but as memory serves me, Owens does have that discussion somewhere in there.
Beautiful. All right, let's go. You good for like 10, 15 more minutes here, Gavin?
Yeah, not a problem.
Okay, cool. Yeah, I got a date night with the wife tonight. We got babysitter and all that. So
yeah. I had a coffee date. So for us, it's coffee dates. That's how we do it.
Yeah. Well, I don't know if I told you this, but we live in the same neighborhood as my dad, actually. So my dad lives 2 houses down. So we're pretty fortunate that we can sneak out every now. Yeah, we can drop the kids off and sneak out every now and then. So
no, for me, the two older ones, we can kind of get them sort of looked after, and then the youngest one, he's at his crash. We can get out to Costa. Don't know if you have Costa in the States, but we get out to Costa. Costa, it's my favorite coffee place. So we get out to Costa, and I can have my Americano and Sicilian lemon muffin.
Sounds great, yeah.
And she has her hot chocolate and her cherry bakewell, and that's our date afternoon.
That's awesome. That sounds great. That sounds very European as well. So, all right, let's see here. Again, everybody, really great questions. I really enjoy this stuff. I love that we can just come on and know we're going to have a great conversation because people just bring such great questions. Saves us work because we don't have to think of a topic beforehand. So,
absolutely.
This is good stuff. Eric says, why does Gaven hold the position that Thomas uses the metaphysical principle of essay in all 5 arguments, even though, as far as I know, this is not the traditional position? So, yeah Gavin, what's your reasoning there?
I think it's because all the 5 ways make that move from what is through another to what is per se. And the per aliud, the feature that they have per aliud is some kind of actuality. So each of the 5 ways gets hold of some kind of actuality, which things have through another, and then makes the inference to what is per se and not per aliud with respect to that actuality. But because essay is the act of all acts, what's going on in the background there is that, he's looking for some fundamental principle of actuality without which nothing would be, which is essay. The 4th way explicitly states that it's a cause of essay, and I think it's implicit in the other ones.
Right, and we will be making this argument in the book we're writing together.
Yeah, but it's a very sort of nuanced approach that I take, because I know that Owens and Canassis, they're way more explicit than I am about that. I link it up with the per aliud to per se principle, where Owens and Nassis, I think, make the point that each of the phenomena that let's say in the argument for motion, what's being considered there is the essay of motion. That motion has a very particular kind of essay, and we're trying to account for that essay. Whereas I'm arguing that it's in fact actuality, and actuality gives us the link to essay.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. Whether we'll go that in depth in our book, we'll see.
It's an introductory text.
Yeah, it's an introductory text, but maybe it'll be a 2nd edition at some point. We'll see. We got to get the 1st edition out first. Parisa says, is St. Thomas a realist? I once listened to a lecture of Professor Haldane where he emphasized his idealist elements. Any thoughts on Thomas as an idealist? So I think this actually, I think, links to what we were talking about before, where Haldane will say, yes, he's a realist, but when it comes to conceptual constitution of things, this is exactly what we brought up before. Like, you think of when we conceptualize a shark, yes, it has fins and this or that, but also as it being vicious. And then the idea there is like, is a shark like in and of itself vicious, or is that just something that reflects upon our concerns and how we relate to the world? So let's get your thoughts on this, right?
So the way I want to come at this is, by going back to McDowell. And McDowell is charged with idealism because he wants to say that the conceptual is unbounded. And given the unboundedness of the conceptual, everything then is conceptual in some sort of way, and that seems to be idealism. But McDowell points out that charge of idealism is committed to the myth of the given, that unless you have some sort of non-conceptual content, everything then as conceptual is, part and parcel of the mind's construction. McDowell wants a sort of a middle approach, that reality is conceptual but not constituted by the mind, that it brings into operation the conceptual episodes of the mind. And I think you have that in St. Thomas, that what idealists tend to hold, that there is conceptual activity going on in the agent intellect, that our intellect exercises some sort of agency, a kind of spontaneity. Idealists tend to hold that. But when Thomas holds that, the spontaneity that the agent intellect introduces is pushing up against the traction from the world, that the agent intellect's spontaneity doesn't come into operation unless the conceptual features of the world or the formal nature of the world brings the agent intellect into operation, because the act of the intellect, the intelligible in act is the intellect in act. So the act of the agent intellect is the form of the thing. In reality, that's what the agent intellect grasps. So that idea that there is spontaneity in the intellect, that's definitely something that idealists hold, but they hold it in order to say that spontaneity is constitutive of the worldhood of the world. For Thomas, that spontaneity is only brought into operation through the formal structures or the conceptual
content by the world itself.
Of reality, and that's not an idealist position.
Cool. That's a good. I think I know what lecture you're talking about. That is a very interesting lecture. Callum says there has never been a time Pat has looked older than 25. Lucky guy.
There you go.
I am in fact older than 25. So we'll say just how old, but I'm in fact older than 25. Parisa says, any thoughts on Professor Stump's quantum theology?
Yes, I wrote an article on it. Aquinas, Stump, and the nature of a simple God. So Stump's quantum theology is she's running up against what appears to be a tension in Aquinas' philosophical theology, and it's that God is pure esse, pure existence itself, but that seems to be like a property. Okay, that's something abstract, like universal, and so that meets with the sort of criticisms that Plantinga gives to it. That can't be a person, a property can't be a person. God is an agent. To be an agent, God has to be concrete and individual. And so God has to be conceived of as an ens, not as pure esse itself, but as an ens. And then Stump argues, she looks at the De Abdematibus, Aquinas' commentary on the De Abdematibus, and points out that, ens is something concrete and participates in esse, whereas esse is something abstract and it doesn't participate in another. And it seems that, God on the one hand has to be conceived as pure esse in order to be pure actuality, but as an ens in order to be agent of creation. How do we unify the two? Well, Stump draws the kind of, analogy with quantum physics, where light can be interpreted both as a wave and as a particle. And so the idea here is that underlying light, there's something weird going on and we don't know what. It's a mystery, but there's some sort of reality there, which reality is able to be both a wave and a particle at the same time. And we just don't know what the reality is underlying. So similarly here, we don't know the divine essence. That's the mystery. We don't know that. But we can still truthfully affirm that God is, esse itself and, concrete like an ens. So we should take the same approach here then in theology as, physicists do in quantum physics, and just say, well, look, the two of these are, united in this admittedly mysterious divine essence. Fair enough, but I have a problem with that. And my problem is that there's an easier way out here. Aquinas affirms that God is pure existence so many times. And in the article, I just take a representative list, from throughout his works where he says God is pure existence itself. And so I think, we can resolve this tension of conceiving of God as pure esse, but also as an agent, as an ens, without having to go to quantum theology, by pointing out that God's being an individual is in virtue of his being pure esse itself. God is an individual because as pure esse itself, God is utterly unique. As utterly unique, there is nothing that could be like God. And that makes God radically individual. God isn't individual in the way individuated things are individual, because they're not radically individual, because they at least have something in common with other individuals of their same kind. God is radically individual because there's nothing that could be like him, given its either. Individuality is enough to have concreteness, to have a concrete agent. So God is a radical individual, a concrete agent, because he is pure esse itself. And so that sort of supposed dichotomy is resolved without having to go to quantum theology. And that's what I argued in my paper. It's in the American Catholic Phil Quarterly.
Excellent. Excellent. Sorry to storm ahead. I just want to get one or two more in here before we before we sign off for the evening. Don says, Therese Corey lectured on Mind and World. She said something akin to hoarseness, horsifying the intellect, like Pat said. If familiar, can explain her view, which she argued was Aquinas's. Are you familiar with much of Dr. Torrey's work, Gavin? I just got her book Aquinas on Self-Knowledge, but I haven't even started it yet, so I can't comment on that.
I'm afraid I'm not familiar with her work. I hope she's not watching. I'm friends with her on Facebook, and I put the link up on Facebook. But
well, she's right. You're welcome on. We'd love to have you on the podcast. So let's connect.
So,
that'd be great.
I mean, what she is saying is just the Thomist position. You know, we were talking about the Thomist position earlier, and so it doesn't surprise me, you know, that she says the same sort of thing, because that is the Thomist position. But I should, you know, read her work. It's just something that I haven't got the chance to reading as yet.
Yeah, let's all right, let's do one more question here. Man, I see lots of good ones. I see one on Stump's book on the Atonement. I love it. I love her book on the Atonement. Have you read her book on the Atonement yet, Gavin?
She gave me a signed copy, and I haven't got round to reading it, but it's related to some research that I'm doing. So over the summer, I do plan to read it.
Yeah. Yes. Sorry, I'm just trying to see what would be a good question to finish up here. Dwong, I see yours about essence energies distinctions. We will do an episode on that at some point. Let's do this one here. Brendan says, if you can convince someone that God exists by argument, how then would you get them to believe in Christianity, or more radically, the sacramental reality of Catholicism? So, like, that's a personal question. How would you do it? How would you do it, Evan?
Okay. So you need faith, okay? And faith involves both an intellectual and a willful component. Intellectually, so faith is the virtue by which we believe what God has revealed, because God has revealed it. The intellectual component is that we know that God exists, and we know that God speaks the truth. And the willful component is that we love God because he is the good. You put those together so that when God does reveal something, we are prepared to believe what he does reveal. Think about spouses who love each other. When your spouse tells you something, when your spouse reveals something to you, because your spouse is your beloved, you believe her, precisely because she is your beloved, and you know your heart is her heart, and her heart is yours, and so it's no question. You just believe what she reveals to you. And it's the same sort of relationship that, the person of faith has with God. My beloved is mine and I am his. My heart belongs to God. And so in belonging to God, when God reveals something to me, I believe that. So when it comes to the truths about Christianity, there are all sorts of historical arguments that you can make for the resurrection and the historical resurrection of Christ. Yes, wonderful. I think you can, make that good historical argument that Christ was resurrected, and then that points, St. Paul, that points to the hope of our future resurrection. That's great. But believing in the sacramental reality of Catholicism, that's something different. That's about accepting, even if you believe that Christ was resurrected from the dead, and that points forth to, your future resurrection, believing in the sacramental reality of Catholicism, that requires an existential commitment to God as your beloved. To God as your beloved, who has undertaken this rescue operation and promised you that throughout your life, if you give yourself to him, if you give your heart to him, that he himself will enter your heart with the Blessed Trinity and transform you through his grace and, bring you into closer union and beatitude with him after death. That requires that personal commitment, which I always like to compare to it's like a marriage, right, that one has with one's spouse. How would I convince somebody of that? Well, through trying my best to lead a life of holiness and letting that person see that life of holiness and how that life of holiness plays an impact on me, but also encouraging that other person to lead a life of holiness as well, so that their heart can be transformed by the grace and the love of God.
Yeah, I know we said earlier that Christianity is hard, but it's dang beautiful as well. It really is. All right, you have a beautiful way of expressing it, Gavin. So thank you for that. really great questions today, guys. Really want to thank, and I know we didn't get through them all. I'm sorry. So if we didn't get to your question or something like that, hold on to it, because we'll obviously be doing more of these, and we would like to revisit that a little bit later. Before we wrap up here, Gavin, what else? Yeah, I mean, we talked about kind of what we were doing at the beginning of the show, but anything else you want to announce or any thoughts you want to finish up with? Yeah.
So I said that it was I was reading I was just reading Stump's treatment of simplicity, and how God could have willed something differently without God as an agent changing. So I'm writing about that at the minute. I'm writing an article on that, and sometimes writing an article, any other people who have written out there, the hardest bit is getting it set up at the start. And I'd started this article many times, but I got the setup today. I got a few thousand words written, and I've got it nicely set up. So I think the article's going to flow nicely out of that. And this ties in with the sort of current part of the on my classical theism book, which is on God's operations, intellect, will, and power. And so an important part of discussing God's operations is how God can act as an agent without changing, given different actions. So God as the agent can remain unchanged, even though his actions can be different. So that's going to be involved in the current chapter that I'm writing on the classical theism book. But on Sunday, I'm away for a week. So my son and I were going to Aquinas Institute of Ireland summer school, which runs every year, where we just gather and we read the text of Aquinas in sort of tutorial groups. It's only open to Irish students this year, just because of COVID regulations and restrictions. But it's been running every year for the past 10 years, and so this year it's at its place in Ireland, and so I get to bring my 10-year-old son with me, so while I'm teaching in the seminars, he's probably going to be on his tablet or his Kindle doing something, and then we get to, we finish by mid-afternoon, and then we get to hang out, and so it's going to be a bit of a break. I'll not say it's well-deserved, but it'll just be a break anyway.
It is. It's well-deserved. You've been working hard. You've been cranking out a lot of words, so...
So I'm just looking forward to that. I feel like I need a break. Although, but I'll disagree with it. I don't feel that I deserve a break, but I feel like I need a break. So I am looking forward to it.
Cool. So no podcast for at least a week then. So
yeah, at least a week. So if anybody's looking to invite me, give me a week, okay?
Yeah, give a week. Actually, you'll be on my wife's podcast at some point. So
yeah, that's right.
That'll be fun. Yeah, my wife's podcast is called The Catholic Mama. So talks a lot about just life as a Catholic mom and stuff. And I think she wants to have you on to like how to introduce your children to philosophy or some topic along those lines. I'm looking forward to that. I think that'll be cool.
Okay, good.
Yeah,
I look forward to that.
Yeah, I see. Just Patrick, Erich, Duong, very, very much thank you for all the kind words. I'm glad you guys enjoyed the show. People are asking for a roundtable with Phaser. Phaser was on a while back. We kind of like when one of his books came out. It was a good conversation. He would certainly be welcome on again. That would be a fun one.
Yeah,
because he reviewed your book. That's right. He reviewed. He reviewed this one, right? Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and I sent him my articles on existential inertia, and we've emailed. We've chatted with each other, but we haven't had a real sort of in-depth back and forward. And I mean, could be a double-edged sword. I mean, some of your viewers might see me and Phaser, sort of discussing and then finding out that we disagree on things, or we have slightly different views.
That's okay.
Right.
This isn't meant to be the agreement cast. We have good clash on here, a fair amount, and I think that's good. That's how wisdom can flow. So no promises, but that would be cool. So who knows? Maybe we'll see if we can set that up at some point. Mm-hmm.
That would be good crack. Yeah, I'd enjoy that.
All right, gentle listeners, thank you for tuning in. Please like, share, subscribe. If you're not on iTunes, honestly, one of the best things you can do for the show is head over to iTunes, find a Pat Flynn Show, subscribe, leave a review. That really helps. Obviously, on YouTube, subscribing and all that helps as well. So we'd super appreciate that. And Gavin, thank you so much, man. Always an absolute pleasure.
Yeah, thank you. It was great.